looking into the capillary exchange of gases and nutrients, depending on where you are, you'll have different amounts. So for example, oxygen and nutrients, they're typically going from the blood into the tissues. That means the arteries will have a higher amount of oxygen compared to the veins. The arteries will have more nutrients compared to the veins a lot of times as well. Now I say a lot of times because there are exceptions. You're going to have some veins coming away from the digestive system, the intestines, that are quite high in nutrients. But carbon dioxide, metabolic waste, those are typically going from the tissues into the bloodstream at the capillaries, which means the venous return is going to have a higher amount of carbon dioxide than the arterial side. And there's also more metabolic waste on the venous side than the arterial side, because it has to go to where it's being offloaded, either kidneys or exhaled in the lungs or wherever. So looking and understanding where these are coming from and going to is important. Because yes, the capillaries exchange a lot of things, but primarily the oxygen is going from capillaries to tissues. Nutrients from capillaries to tissues. Carbon dioxide is the tissue to the capillary. Metabolic waste, tissue to capillary. Now, if they are lipid soluble, they simply diffuse right through the membrane, which makes sense because the membrane is the phospholipid bilayer. So the solubility is the same. So those molecules can fuse directly through the actual membrane. But if it's a water-soluble solute, so water-soluble, you just go through the clefts or the fenestrations. Reason being is because water and lipid doesn't really mix very well, you can't have those water-soluble components going through the actual phospholipid bilayer. And then if you have larger molecules, so think about proteins here, for example, those a lot of times are actively transported across the membrane in pinocytotic vessels. So think about these large structures that are meant to open up, accept the proteins, and then pull them through the membrane in the inside. Because they're active transport, that means they require ATP to function. So you need energy. So again, look at the capillaries. Remember, we're talking about going through the cleft, through these holes, these fenestrations, or through the actual gaps that are in there for the sinuses. So different structures, depending on the different types of capillaries, allow passage through for the water-soluble or the larger components. So just to look at a little more detail here. First off, again, diffusion right through the membrane. You're seeing it right here. That is going to be your lipid soluble, going right through the actual cell membrane. But then if it's not lipid soluble and it's water soluble, then you're looking at this one going through the inner cellular cleft. So it has to go through a space that's opened. You can't go through the membrane. Beyond that, you get to the movement through these fenestrations. So you have these water-soluble pieces going right through these openings in the actual molecule. So the openings are passing right through there. And then finally, you get to the vesicles. So going through the pinocytotic vesicles or these capillae, you're seeing you're going right into them. They open up, accept those things like proteins, whatever, and then bring them into the cell or into the tissue that way. So you have different transport mechanisms depending on solubility and on size. So all these different capillaries are functioning the same, going from blood to tissue, tissue to blood, but depending on the solubility will depend on how they're actually moved across the actual membrane.